Hi, everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Broken Rails 1238th New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Lydia Millet and Mandana Chaffa. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Lydia Millet's newest book is Atavists Stories. She has written many novels and story collections, along with a work of nonfiction called We Loved It All, A Memory of Life. Her novel, A Children's Bible, was a National Book Award finalist in a New York Times Book Review Best 10 Books of 2020. Other books have been honored by the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Penn Center USA, and as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Since 1999, she has worked as a writer and editor at the Center for Biological Diversity. And our host today, Mandana Chaffa, is founder and editor-in-chief of Nowruz Journal, a periodical of Persian arts and letters, and a finalist for the Community of Literary Magazines and Press's Best Magazine Debut, and, and an editor-at-large at Chicago Review of Books. She serves on the board of the National Book Critics Circle, where she is the vice president of the Barrios Book and Translation Prize and is president of the board of the Flowchart Foundation. Born in Tehran, Iran, she lives in New York. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Mandana, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Min. A big thank you to you, Maglie, Chloe, and Elizabeth for creating these really terrific venues for us to have these conversations. I will say, once you read Lydia's bio, I was about to text you and say, please just don't read my bio. Just here's Mandana talking for us. What an amazing pleasure it's going to be to talk with you, Lydia. But I was hoping we might get started with you reading any one of your favorite excerpts from the book. Atavists, and maybe you might tell us which particular short story there is, and then we can get into conversation.
Sure, yeah, and thanks for everyone for being here, and thanks to my colleagues for their hosting of these conversations. I will just read. Let me say a bit about the story. This book looks like this, and the cover is actually sort of my favorite part, although I did not design it myself. And it's a bunch of stories, each of which the title of each of which ends with the suffix ist. So, mixologist, let's see, mixologist, therapist, cosmetologist, insurrectionist, gerontologist, and so forth. And actually, I first wanted to call the book just the ists,
Oh.
but the sales team was not on board with that because because they argued it was not a word. And people like titles to be words oftentimes when they're trying to sell them. Anyway, I will read just 3 pages, not a long reader, from the first story, which is called Tourist. She was courting her own disgust these days. The way she'd picked at her knee scabs as a kid, knowing it would end in blood, but doing it anyway. Revulsion was a stimulant. The surest route to that stimulation was the feed of a guy who'd once been a friend. Not a close friend, but one she'd respected back then. In recent years, he seemed out of reach to the likes of her, neither rich nor well connected, as so many of his other contacts on social media appeared to be. He was a busy man, a consultant on public art projects. The work was rewarding, of course, but the real path to redemption for him lay in fatherhood. His tiny daughter was a paragon. He'd relate his dialogues with her in the comments on his Instagram, conversations that showcased her innocence and powers of perception, along with the wisdom of his sensitive answers. One dialogue concerned an incident some centuries before when a famous man of science had been burned at the stake. Yes, father and daughter had discussed this dreadful event. They had to, because the tiny daughter was always engaged in the learning process, be it pre-calculus far beyond her years, the careful study of wildflowers plucked from their own tangled and picturesque garden, or in this case, the history of the Inquisition. To comfort her, her father said the person had, by means of his immolation, quote, dispersed his atoms back into the universe he loved. The phrase allowed him to illustrate key attributes of himself. First, that he, like the scientist, knew some physics. For was it not physics that allowed us all to understand how the particles that make up being flow across time in seeming infinitude through the bodies of the living and celestial alike? Do we not breathe in the very same particles that traveled through the lungs of Julius Caesar as he died? Second, it showed he could transmute a tale of violent execution into romantic poetry, for the scientists had perished on a noble altar, the pursuit of knowledge. And third, it showed how he wished to manifest for his tiny, adorable daughter, and in passing his several thousand followers, the fineness of his sentiments. How flawed we are, he acknowledged in another comment. We cast our sins even beyond the planet now, into low Earth orbit, for example, where lethal space junk floated in a massive debris field, the outermost garbage dump of a civilization imploding, and none too slowly either. But one thing he could do was uphold the sacred trust of raising a child, teaching her that even upon this sadly devastated sphere, the two of them could bear witness to the wonders that remained. To attest to that wonder, he posted portraits of the tiny daughter with gentle beams of light falling across her doe-like face. She could be seen in soft focus with a book open across her lap, solemn in her attention, solving math puzzles on a table in the living room beneath a soaring vaulted ceiling, walking in the dappled shade of a suburban bower, a sprig of frail blossoms tucked behind one ear, or tenderly cradling a beloved doll. But he did not stop there. His wife was a paragon too, a genius as well as a beauty. He was humbled by her excellence. Often he referred to her using an honorific, Dr. Peterson. She was an expert in chaos theory. She'd written a book on the subject and hailed from an enlightened nation in Northern Europe where the weather was cold but the government warm. Free health care, for example, was the birthright of its citizens. 16 months of paid parental leave for single mothers, even. His wife was blonde and lovely and wore cat-eye reading glasses. Uxorious was the term that came to mind, an antiquated word for men who displayed an unctuous adoration of their spouses. There were other words for it now. He's a wife guy, Mom, said Sam when she showed him the feed. He shrugged. It's the thing. The preening was unbearable, yet Trudy checked the account compulsively, indignant every time, caught in a cycle of presentation and condemnation, like bad reality TV. Contempt was natural, defensive probably, in a form of catharsis, but she wasn't uplifted by her daily practice of revulsion. If anything, she was debased by it. Still, she returned. Sometimes she thought she was waiting for him to step forward with a confession. The scales have fallen from my eyes, he might suddenly admit. I see it clearly now. The coy obscenity of how I praise others, only to elevate myself.
Mm.
And I will stop there.
Thank you so much. We would do well just to have you read from this beautiful collection. I'm excited that you started with tourists, not just because it's the first piece, but I think it sets the stage so well about some of the major things that you're talking about. Um, at the outset, certainly, there's this issue of social media, but what I love most is that that's not the primary thread. That's just a vehicle of showing how people connect or don't connect. Um, and this idea, I had a lot of quotes from the first part, but that there's a gap between the performance and the lives themselves. And the point is not to be, but to seem. Let the gesture stand for a soul. Um, there's a line in there that in the new world, she would always be a tourist. And I thought about that just in terms of our lives in general. In a way, we are only tourists in this particular plane, right? We kind of come in, we try to figure out where the best coffee is and what kind of coffee we want to have. And we had a lovely conversation in the green room about coffee, which I will not get into. And then we're a tourist in this land, and by the time we get through it, we get comfortable in some areas, but we're not exactly at home, as it were. What I guess the first question is, how was Tourist the first story? Is that how you started it when you were thinking about this collection of ists? Was Tourist what started it all for you?
No, in fact, there was another story before this that I took out of the collection um, because it was too potentially libelous.
Now, of course, that's the story I want to read, but all right, maybe privately we'll talk about that.
Yeah, so I started yeah, it was one of my favorite stories, but you know, we do what we have to do. I Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, we can see ourselves as tourists, I guess, or we can see ourselves as guests.
Even
Or
better.
we can see ourselves as natives, animals among the other animals. But I think that there's a particular sort of tourist aspect to contemporary American culture. You know, this sort of this surface, this surface being, um, all these reflections, right? How we see ourselves everywhere reflected and um, seek to project images of ourselves to our friends and neighbors and far beyond them. And so I don't know, even though, you know, a tourist is ostensibly there um, to experience a new land, there's a way in which we foreclose our experience habitually now by only ever being fed what we've already chosen to eat, as it were, chosen to consume. You know, we are set up by technology um, and our customs, our current culture
Yeah, you had a
to
great
always like replicate
you had a
our
great
previous
line.
choices, right? Like,
Yeah. You had a great line in there. Have I updated my OS recently, my operating system? And that really struck me hard because I wonder about that sometimes for myself. Um, am I within
actually,
this
you
point in life?
if I can interrupt,
Sure.
that was one of those things where I had written that, and then I heard someone on the radio also use that phrase, which I think is in the book.
Right.
And I felt like I had sort of pre-stolen. Obviously, it's not like particularly novel turn of phrase, but the notion that you know, an older generation of folks has failed to kind of adapt to new cultural norms around like the isms, right? Which I was originally writing about. This was a book about the different isms, and the ists sort of were were contained in the isms, you know, like all the
Right.
sorts of, you know, racism, sexism,
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but this comedian was talking about uh how people, old white people, I think in this case, had just failed to update. They were just lagging behind what is now known.
Well, so you've already, you're killing me because you've already answered a couple of the questions I have, which means you're like the best kind of interview guest. Um, I think a lot about classifications because you definitely, this book has a lot to do with classifications, self-classifications, how we classify others. And I wonder if that's one of the ways that we deal with what has always been a challenging world. Especially some of the younger folks, they're all kind of thinking about the apocalypse and the end of things. Certainly with the climate crisis, that's a very fair thing for us to be thinking about. But I think if you look back historically, the end of the world has always been nigh, one way or the other. And it's typically been nigh, not even because of people, but because of the environment. And perhaps the only way that we're able to manage that is to classify ourselves and others to give us certain structure so that you feel you're cemented to something, you're rooted to something, as opposed to just kind of flying into space alone, untethered. Um, and what you also do exceedingly well in this is that what I should say is that these are loosely interconnected stories. And I say loosely because each of them really stands on its own, but then you see the characters in different places throughout the book. And what you do so well is that that someone who is secondary in one story becomes primary in another, and that is certainly the human condition, right? In my life, I am the primary story. I can't help but be. But then I might be a small tertiary part of somebody else's story. Were these some of the things that you had been thinking about even in your nonfiction books that you wanted to explore in fiction? What did the fiction element give you, given what a beautiful writer you are in nonfiction, to go through some of these issues about connection, lack of connection, and rooting yourself in the world?
I mean, I do think, and I've written for a long time about just that the tension, I think, in our conceptions of ourselves and life and the universe and all those the grandiose things, the tension between the longing for um, personal freedom, mental freedom, um, all the freedoms, and this longing for community, sort of a longing for privacy and autonomy, and also a great loneliness, and desire for communion with other people. And I think there's always this, like with human beings, there's a sort of ontological, always existing kind of tension between those two yearnings and those two needs. And so I've always been interested in like self and other and self and community um and and the sort of, I mean, I and the sort of ascendance of like the critical necessity of mental privacy, right? Like if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have ourselves. But at the same time, and there always seems to be this kind of membrane between us and the rest of the world. And of course, like our our stories, and I've written about this a fair amount, our stories, and other people have too. Our stories are, I think, in the West in particular, in sort of um, dominant myths of the West. Our stories are really individualistic, and they are sort of hero narratives, and um, all about the arc of the self. And I feel, I felt strongly for a long time, in part due to the crises of climate and extinction, mass extinction, that it behooves us to write different stories about the collective and not just about how one hero prevails over her or his opponents and enemies. And so, but it's really hard to write that kind of story. It's hard to write stories about the collective that aren't a big yawn.
No, well,
um,
these are definitely
and yeah, and
not a
so
big.
it's a way of writing about the collective, I guess is what I'm saying, to have stories where different weights are given to different kind of protagonists over time and over chronology. It's one way of doing that. Not necessarily the best, but
I think it's pretty damn good in these stories. One thing I really loved, this was upon the second reading that I really started to see these particular lights and nuances, is that the intergenerational aspect of these stories, it's not only about people of a certain age and a certain time. And I really love the way you draw the young folks, because they're not one thing or the other. They are all trying to get the same kind of connection. And by and large, they succeed. I mean, um, there was one line, you had the sadness of wanting, the sadness of hope, which, but there is a lot of hope in these stories. Do you know what I mean? These kids are trying to get things done. They are connecting with others, and you've allowed each of the characters throughout the book to grow. Maybe not the tertiary ones, but there's a lot of growth. I mean, it didn't surprise me that you ended on a story that was called Optimist, because despite all of this, I actually thought that these stories were incredibly optimistic because the people were changing. And I felt that you wanted and needed to reflect that, not to say everything's hunky dory and great, but that in that first story, at the very end of it, um, Trudy is with her son, Sam, who's sad about his father not necessarily being in his life, and she stops him somewhere and she says, run. And he's like, basically, Mom, what are you crazy? She said, run. And that was another that for me brought it back to the very end and the end back to the beginning, because what else can we do as mortals except to keep moving and to keep running? And were you thinking that hopefully when you were writing these? And actually, yes, was this always an ist book for you? Or did these stories come from different times in your life and you put them together and said, I can make a collection out of this?
No, they were all written, I have this really like simple-minded brutalist way of writing, which is just like sort of from beginning to end. I don't really make patchworks or like pastiches and put them together. So yeah, I wrote them all in a row, kind of between, like I now have this habit in middle age where I work on more than one book at once. So if I get tired of something I'm doing, I default to the other thing. And it gives me space from the first thing in which to contemplate its failings, you know. So stories come usually like between patches of work on a novel, but more or less in a row. Um, and yeah, I guess I don't this question of hope is one that people raise a lot um nowadays. And I have like kind of kind of an ambivalent relationship with the word and with the meaning of the word, because I think it's, and I wrote about this a little bit in We Loved It All, the memoir like book that came before this one. But this, we can say hope, um, and actually just mean um, that we are optimistic and um, trying to do the best we can and remain relatively cheerful in the face of adversity and stuff. Or we can say hope and treat it as a form of passivity, and like everything is going to work out, and there have always been problems, and and that interpretation of hope is not helpful. This sort of like just um invocation of hope, this sort of like vague affect that we can go to as an excuse not to act. And I think sometimes like this kind of panacea notion of hope, like I think you have to embody hope for it to be anything. It's of course true that despair is the enemy of hope, and despair is no good, and it's apathy and whatever. But hope can also just be really quite
Apathetic. Yeah.
empty word, right? It's like it can be quite empty. Like, yeah, I hope that happens. I have no agency in the situation, but I hope, So I'm always like, yeah, I'm always troubled by the sort of politics of the word hope.
Well, you could say the same thing about despair, right? Despair could push you to action. And I think is we talked about this a little bit briefly, but I'd like to go into something we both were fascinated by, which is language and our proficiency with it, right? So it bends what seems, but at the end of the day, the situation is still what it is. For example, climate change. We still have a lot of different words for climate change. And I get to the point where I don't care about the prettiness of the language, whether you say global warming or climate change, but how do we change the situation? So I think you used a word once about language, in a sense, can be used as propaganda. And I think you very subtly underscore that throughout this collection. Um, that people feel they have to say certain of the right things. And if you say the wrong thing, then you're kind of canceled for it. But at the end of the day, your very subtle question throughout is, well, what are you doing about it? Are you all doing something about it? And some of these people are. Mia, for me, was the most pleasant surprise in this collection. First as someone's sister and someone's daughter, and then this really delightful young woman who decides to do something with the elderly people in her community.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of um, right. I mean, it's very stark right now, the sort of role of propaganda, right, in this country and other countries too. But um, that we've created this situation where, yeah, on the left there's cancel culture, and on the right there's uh, lies, right? Like really outright
Hmm.
falsifications of factual reality. But then on the right, yeah, and there's also this thing where like children, um, the right kind of accuses the left of everything that it's actually doing, so that it has this, it's this perfect circuit of uh, just outright
I
I
am rubber, you are glue. You know, whatever you say bounces off me.
Yeah, yeah, and we also we have this information uh, economy that is tragic, right? Where um, it's like the ultimate devaluation of language as currency, because it's a kind of 1984 situation where um, you know, lies are truth, and truth is lies. And so I think that language is this public language has just become so extraordinarily, it's been butchered sort of over the past decade or so, or maybe a little less. I mean, you can go back, of course, and look at precedents for it, but really the scale is unprecedented of bad information and gullible information consumption. And I think that has a lot to do with us as a culture not really being able to understand um, the difference between rhetoric, uh, where rhetoric ends and propaganda begins, and how to scrutinize language to make sure that it refers to something concrete in the world. And we seem to have lost that knack recently, and also lost the knack for character judgment, connected, I think, to this
Well, that was a great,
tragic devaluation of
yeah,
language.
that great line in Tourist, being uplifted by revulsion. I have to say, you know, reading all of this, I kind of saw my own hypocrisies in a lot of ways, right? The things that I tend to watch and don't watch sometimes. And um, would it be better if I were only watching PBS, though now I guess PBS is going away too, because I do skate into some of the more easy types of entertainment sometimes too, right? And that
Mhm.
skews one's perception. And it's like anything else. If you look at any of these TikTok or whatever, if you stop at one dog video, suddenly all you see are dog videos. If you stop at one rant, suddenly you see that rant again and again and again. So in a way, we're self-creating our world if we don't pay enough attention to what we're doing. And I was really thinking about that. There was also a beautiful line. I think this was Buzz's line that had to do with looking at social media as a window or a mirror. That one. Yeah, I don't write, as you know, I don't write in my books. I don't do, the books are sacred. But I have like many tabs on that book, and I wrote it down on a lot of sheets of paper because both of those, as a window or a mirror,
Yeah,
you
I
have
mean,
to
I
be
think
careful. You
I
have to be
think
careful with both.
right. I mean, I do. Right, that's true. That's true. I think that these tools we have were so at the beginning, um, full of potential and possibility and excitement, and they still have that potential. But it
Yeah.
does seem that the way that, in a kind of aggregate sense, we've chosen to use them has been, I mean, it's clearly been a net harm. And it is sort of heartbreaking because you can see beautiful things in those windows, and you can see things that you never would have seen, obviously, historically. Things so far away from you, so removed. and so lovely and true, and but the problem is that we've chosen mostly to use the tools in other ways that actually just kind of double down on everything limiting about ourselves.
Yeah. And it makes me think about how we consume food, right? You want to tell people to see what you're consuming. It's like, don't not have the French fries, but we don't do that with our video well, I don't think consummation's the word I want. With how we feed off videos, we can be taking in a lot of unnutritious things, and I'll speak for myself with that. And then you turn around and wonder why you might be feeling the way that you're feeling. And so what I love about this is that you're in no way are you saying don't consume this stuff. But every one of these stories, you want people to be a little more aware about what they're doing and why. And at the end of the day, so you had uh, someone who was into these role play games. You have Mia who was into a lot of her online stuff and all. But at the end of the day, they all end up having certain connections that have deep, deep meanings for them. Like Mia going to um, home for the elderly and helping them get on computers and get on their phones and be able to do what they couldn't do otherwise. So at the end of the day, not that I think you're trying to say, here is here's the master theme of this collection. But a lot of the satisfaction comes from face to face human interaction. And I found that really compelling. Um,
I mean, I think we do underrate the neurological, I mean, generally as a culture, underrate or dismiss, not contemplate, whatever, the sort of the neurology of all this, the way that our brains and bodies interact with screens, where, there's early kind of emergent scholarship to say that our brains weren't built for this. They didn't evolve for this, and so the effects are profound. And I think it's so easy, and I'm like this too. I'm with my phone
oh, it's the
most of the
same as me.
time, and but it is this. We don't, I think, recognize. It's one thing to sort of be a cyborg because we sort of essentially, at least temporarily, are, right? Because what's the difference between having the phone in our hand or our pocket all the time and having it embedded in our skin? I mean, it's a pretty small difference actually, in
It
some
will
way.
be. It will be at some point. I
Right,
mean, I'm
right. It's
not
entirely
young, so
possible if we
probably
if we
not in my lifetime. But
yeah, I mean, it's entirely probable that some version of that will occur in some demographics, right? But I
yeah,
think that meanwhile, we are these porous beings that are dependent on our senses and are using them less and less. And where we used to survive through all of them, more than five, as science now knows. We have many senses that haven't really been um, deeply studied, but are known to exist. Proprioception, for example.
right.
Um, but we more and more just use our eyes and our ears, and neglect touch and smell, for example, because we're embedded in the pixels and in the screens, and we are enraptured. And what does it mean, like, to our brains that we're not using those other senses as much as we used
Right.
to? Um,
Absolutely.
are those senses fading? What does that mean for us and our bodies as animals?
I
I
think
think
those
it means a
things
lot.
are,
I think
yeah,
it's
yeah.
non-trivial, incredibly non-trivial.
I agree with you. I don't think it's trivial at all. And back to some of the earlier parts of this conversation, I don't know what can be done. I don't want to say even to change it, but to halt it. I get it's kind of all of these things, even like climate change. How do you? I'm not even saying it's not going to go back to what it was in when I came to this country in 1971. But how do we halt it from getting a lot worse? And I I don't, again, what I love about these stories is you did not come up and say, well, here's what I'm trying to say. But you do say something about the fact that perhaps one of the ways you combat it is by having more quiet time or having real interactions with people however way they are. And from that, making your own little community something a little better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about awareness, not just self-awareness, but awareness of the world around us. And I think we're at this juncture where there's a real gap between the sort of magnitude of what presses down on us um, and the ambition of our efforts toward awareness. I think that that gap needs to be closed. And of course, to say how this can be done. I mean, that's the question, right?
well, it's
But I
also
think
kind
but
of a
it has to be
Western
asked.
construct. Yeah, and it's also a Western construct, right? To a large extent, in terms of our reliance on technology, and all of that. One of the things, this is near the end, but it relates to, I must say, have you ever written poetry? Because there's some incredibly lyrical points to this, which again, as I said, I've labeled and labeled. Near the end, um, on that last page, you were talking about, one of the characters was talking about looking for a sign in synchronicity. And once we see it, well, then we may do something. Meanwhile, the smaller signs are all around. So many of them that together they are a giant sign. And we go on as if we don't see it. And wow. I mean, that's a
Well,
hell of a good way to go. But it's true. We're not gonna, I think the days are gone where you get the burning bush and the 10 tablets, right? You know, that's nice. Even with our own little lives. I'm not even talking about major life things. When you're thinking, well, do I make this change? Do I move? Do I do this? And we are waiting for these big, big signs to say, go do this. And in the meantime, we're missing all of the other smaller pieces that together maybe make a whole of what your natural instinct should be. We've lost that instinctual sense, I think, because of all of this technology and looking at others.
yeah, I mean, I did write poetry in college. Needless to say, it was not good. It was not good. I was just looking at it recently because I've been going through old files of like memorabilia and stuff, and yeah, I saw some of the poems. Luckily, I mean, I do love I do love reading poetry and am really judgmental about it. Um, I mean, I love so much some
So I'm
poems,
not gonna
and
t- I'm not gonna ask you who do you hate because that's not fair.
yeah, no, that's
Tell
not
me,
nice.
tell me who do
But
you
I so
like?
I have
Yeah.
some opinions. I have some opinions. As George Bush Sr. said, I have some opinions. I just don't always agree with them. But anyway, no, I do. So unfortunately, yeah, I was into sort of the lyrical, trying to sort of mimic, the poets I was reading in college, and also wrote a lot of poems in French when I lived in France as a like study abroad person. But yeah, they were. I think I just learned that the way to go for me is to try to like turn a phrase so that I like it inside prose
Yeah,
because
that's a
yeah,
beautiful way of putting
because
it.
because I am really it's easy to step wrong with poetry because it's such a self-conscious form, and the delicacy required of it is extraordinary. And and so when it's like for example, I love W.S. Merwin. I love his
Beautiful.
his poems and his prose very much. Um, and uh, and in reading him, not always. I mean, there are always every good poet has written a bad poem or two, and then you can see the missteps, sort of, and or what you construe to be the missteps. But yeah, I think I took on a modest task in writing fiction in a way.
I
You
would
know,
push, I would
modest,
push
or
back on that. I would push back on that because what you talk about, the delicacy, certainly in short fiction, um, is it's you can tell when the delicacy is lost, right? I mean, you really can. Um, I won't touch
Yeah,
novels
that's
with
true.
that, but certainly even with nonfiction, memoir, creative nonfiction. Boy, if something feels off, it's really off. So
Hmm.
I would suggest that
Yeah.
it's whether or not you want to do it, it's a very similar practice when you're as accomplished a writer as you are.
Oh,
Uh,
can I get something? Can I get something? It'll take me like 2 seconds because
yes,
it's
you
right
can.
over here. Okay.
I'll do an interpretive dance a la Martha Graham while we're waiting. No? Okay. Okay, Elizabeth, I won't do the interpretive dance.
Okay. I just want to like stump for this book, which is poems. It's like prose poems
Right.
that I just encountered. It came out like last month or something like that. And I did a reading with the person who wrote it, and it's just so great. It's like unassailably great. The poems are mostly like in the form of prose. In
Oh,
fact, they all are.
yeah.
So it was easier for me not to be judgmental about it. But it's really an expansive and excellent, and it's the first book by this person who's someone I lived with in college from
Oh,
and hadn't seen for God, I mean, since like 19, I mean, virtually hadn't seen except for 5 minutes at a party since 1990. So, and I was totally shocked by how much I loved it. So, anyway, I just want to say Book of Potions by Lauren Whitell. It's great. So there is some like contemporary poetry that I adore. They're just, it's
yeah.
harder for me to find. Um, but anyway, it's sort of a digression on my part. I do want to do that ad though, because why not do an ad?
I think that's great. Uh, now I'm thinking I have to go back. Are there other ists that didn't make it into the book that you can talk about,
Um, I think
except for the one
I
that
think
shall not be?
that's the, yeah, I think that was the only one I took out, although I did have different ideas for stories, but they were too kind of on the nose, and the ists were too obvious.
Right.
And so I had to kind of tone down my ists, you know.
Well, yeah, because you know what it is interesting because it sounds like insurrectionist. Gerontologist. Yet the the person, it's a funny thing to say that someone is a gerontologist when they're as young as they are. And I like that kind of sly humor, which is really throughout the collection. There's a lot of little pieces of sly humor like that, that you have this, what, 18-year-old or 17-year-old who is the gerontologist. And
I
indeed,
did almost take
she is.
out one of the stories. Oh, thank you.
Come on.
Sorry. Didn't
Oh,
mean
no,
to
go ahead.
interrupt. I think I have a bit of a lag, so apologies for any interruption and rudeness. Um, I did consider taking one of the stories out, and I'm still not sure I shouldn't have.
It's a
And it
little.
was the one called Pastoralist, just about that really kind
Oh,
of
I see.
incel kind of guy, because he's just so not incel, but you know what I mean. Like he's just so vile
Yeah.
and he's so repugnant. And it's like it's difficult to read um about him. But then he was kind of like interwoven into the other stories, and so I left it in there. But I'm still like, talk about repulsion. He's this like repulsive character, and he's sort of without redemption. And all of us have,
And he
somebody.
makes out like a bandit at the end too, right? Like his story turns out pretty good for him,
Mm.
as we can tell.
Well, in a way,
Right. You know,
right? Like I think the intent is like he attains wealth, but like
he loses something.
maybe not much else, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and he loses something he may not realize he's lost, right? We're
Right.
all making those deals as we're going through life. And sometimes it's only at a certain age that you realize that you lost something very important about your own soul by making all those little small deals. Again, deals with the devil are not always big. Sometimes they're
Right.
very small, incremental things um,
Yeah. Yeah. They can be,
that end
yeah,
up making a
little
difference when you,
sidelines.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the subtlety of these repetitions and accumulations are both literal and figurative throughout the thing. And it makes you think about your own life. What are the repetitions in my own life that I'm really not thinking about as much,
Mhm.
becoming a very big whole of who I am. Um,
It's so easy to get sort of sedimented in, right, as we get older, even I don't know. I feel like, I mean, it depends on the person, of course, but like even starting in our 30s,
Already.
and easier now because of this self-replication of media and social contact, right? But like it's so easy to just stay with the preferences you've had, but also begin to give up the things you used to do
And then what do you,
that
and
were
then what are you left
joyful or like
with?
adventurous or like the thought experiments you used to sort of unwittingly perform on your experience in the world fall to the side because you just want to be effective in your day, or you're just kind of underwater for one reason or another. It's just it's really easy
Or
to
you're
just
trying not to make any mistakes.
yeah, it's easy to
You know,
stop growing and calcify.
failure is great. I don't want to have failure, 24/7.
No,
Uh,
it's good to keep failing. It's
that
good
means
to
I'm
keep
trying something.
failing.
I'm
Yeah.
very good at failing, by the way.
I've
I
definitely
could
had
get a
some
PhD
failures.
in
Yeah.
failure, but
Yeah.
going back to how finally you use language is to take away the purely negative approach to failure. Uh,
Right. No,
that
agreed. Yeah.
failure is always bad and success is always good.
Right. No, th those things are clearly demonstrably
And
not the
I
case.
think you really, really play with language that way in such a way that um, it ends up being, forgive me, I hate when people do this, and I'm doing this, when you take one piece of work and you try to compare it to another piece of work, but it's a kind of a very modern our town that you're kind of approaching. And
Hmm.
our town, the first time I saw it, I was young. I didn't appreciate it. I'm like, what does this
Yeah.
mean? What does this have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do? The older I got, the more I thought, oh yeah, the things that you don't necessarily get back. And then all the little joys, going back to the little joys. So I saw it not as a replication of our town, but I could feel the same feelings, which I'm probably not expressing well because they're right here. And these words, I can't express well. I shouldn't be able to express well. These are different words. These are words
Hmm.
I'm looking at you in the face, and you know what I'm thinking when I say it. Um, and I love this
It's
idea.
really impossible, I think, to have, I mean, it's really important to have things that are impossible to articulate, right? The
Yeah.
ineffable and the sublime. And it's really important to have always the beyond words as well as the words.
Well, that's what, if I think about COVID, and for those of us who are maybe immunocompromised and the like, it's only taken me 5 years now to really recognize some of what it's taken away, which is that touch. We were talking about the different
Yeah.
senses.
Yeah.
So I'm living in a world of language, which is a great world, but these other senses aren't getting used the same way anymore.
Right.
And the pandemic did that
Yeah.
for a lot of people, maybe not everybody. And so we're using different senses, and we're using technology to try to feed something that's physical that can't
Mhm.
get fed otherwise.
Yeah.
Um, so what I love this line, and I know I keep going through lines in the book, but now I have read it 3 times at this point. Um, she might have satellites, or she might be a satellite herself. What was the difference? They were all revolving. Just that's a
Mia.
That's
Yeah.
a really delightful way to think about the life that we're living right now. And that's what I mean by not the hopey hope with the capital letters and all, but these little silver lines of hope that are woven throughout these stories. And each time, for me, each of them has to do with some sort of connection that people make.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think that's what for, I mean, for so many of us, whether we're sort of relatively introverted or relatively like extroverted, um the human and whatever more than human um contacts of life are actually what bring us out of profound despair and depression and many other forms of um, mental distress, emotional distress, like that is the thing that we are these social critters finally, and we do need that real touch, even if we want to or need to retreat from it afterward and gather strength, we still desperately need it, you know?
Absolutely. There was a beautiful line that I think it was Buzz. He said, "How humble things are made precious by feeling." Do you have a humble thing somewhere in your home in Arizona that is made precious by feeling?
Well, in that story, I was writing about an
Bunny.
actual, really literally, it's a bunny, it's a
Yeah, the
stuffed
bunny.
animal bunny, and I was thinking of my daughter's, which is she's she's off at college, but it still sits in her room, and yeah, I do in particular sort of effigies, but other things too. I mean, I think that there's a kind of real power to animist ways of seeing things. How just objects in the world that we don't deem to be alive can become like vessels of awareness um, and play a role that is not unlike the roles of living things.
Yeah, well, it's what we imbue in them, right? It's a human essence in an inanimate object. That inanimate object kind of has its own superpowers at some point.
Yeah.
You know, that sounds a little woo-woo, but I'm a teeny tiny bit a little woo-woo.
No, everything is, it only has meaning in so far as we endow it with meaning.
Right.
And
And
yeah,
then be careful what you endow with meaning. You know,
right,
there's the other
right.
side, right? Be very careful what you endow.
It's a
Uh,
minefield. It's a minefield.
um, so I know we're going to probably get started with the Q&A soon, but if I could just read one more really beautiful quote, because it's the same about this book, and really it's the same about this sort of beautiful experience with you and all the people here, and then the people later here and all of that, which is, "Tonight all our paths are crossing. And from this day till the last day, they will never cross again." My voice like got teared up when I think about that. And that's why I am genuinely grateful to have this kind of opportunity to speak with you, and certainly appreciate the Rail for everything they've done to create this, because this becomes its own little sacred place, right? To talk about the book and then also and put a little bit of ourselves in that conversation.
Well, thank you so much for reading it so closely and more than once. That was very
Thank you
kind.
so much for writing it so beautifully. I mean, you know, it's hard to talk about a book if you don't love it, right? I mean,
Yes, 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 I have that problem. Yeah.
okay, you and I definitely do have to have some of your fine coffee together, and we'll talk about the things, including the missing chapter. And one day I want to see if I can find that in the dark web, the missing chapter.
Yes, no
The
doubt.
ist that shall
Exists
not be
somewhere.
named.
Right.
That's private. I'm sorry, everyone. That's gonna
No,
have to.
not at all, not at all. I said it. I opened the door.
So, dearest Min, should I throw it to you?
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you
so
so
much.
much. That was so brilliant. We have some questions from the audience, and we highly encourage you to send us more questions through the link in the chat. The first question is from Laura Waddington. Thank you for such an inspiring talk. As you were speaking, Herman has kept coming into my mind, particularly some of the essays in his wonderful book about old age, which is all about life. And then you mentioned him. Is there anything more you would like to say about any connection you may have to his work? I missed the first minutes of the talk, so sorry if this already came up in more detail.
This would be for you, right, Mandana?
I think this would be for you, Lydia.
Oh, I didn't think I mentioned Hess, although I wish I had, but
I
I'm
don't
too
think I mentioned
ignorant.
this
I'm
either.
too ignorant. I don't think I've read him since, maybe I inadvertently,
I think you might
I
have. You know,
stole from him without knowing that I'd stolen from him. Maybe Laura, if she's still there, she could tell us what she thought was a reference to Hess or Hesse.
although
But no pressure, no pressure. I
no,
mean,
no,
we
and
can
also
also come
it
back to
just
that
kind of
too.
makes sense. I don't think we talked about Hesse, but certainly if you think about Siddhartha and this idea of going inward to find peace, does make sense. But also, Lydia, I
And
have
we
an
can
eight.
go to the next question then if Laura wants to say what she was
Love to
talking
hear
about.
it.
I fear I am not like erudite enough to have recognized it. But I would be happy to come back to it.
Amazing. The next question is from T. I see your camera's on. Would you like to ask the question yourself, or should I read it for you?
Go ahead and read it. I don't think I have a copy of what I wrote.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure thing. T asked, "Hi Lydia, thank you so much for your work. The characters in Nativus seem to teeter between absurdity and genuine ache. How do you see atavism functioning as a metaphor for the way we live now, especially in a culture of so much noise, shame, and emotional dislocation?" Thank you for sending that question.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a hard one because, how I mentioned at the beginning that I first had titled the book The Ists, and then the sales folks didn't want that title, which I understood very, very much. So I conceived of atavist because I've always loved that word and because it kind of has, these double meanings, as I believe is written on the book jacket. Um, Around, first of all, it's kind of a troubled term itself,
Mhm.
and it's sort of um, reference to primitivism. It's just a really charged word, and I also am intrigued by its history as both a medical term, like a science term in botany, and psychiatric, very highly problematic psychiatric idiom, um, that talks that that was linked to eugenics and all kinds of other nasty ideas. So what I named this book Atavist for was really just the notion of a sort of maybe primordial kind of um, ancestry, a kind of all like that we share, um, notions of returning to some previous form, as in sort of biology, where atavism refers to, the resurgence, the reemergence of a particular physical trait in an organism, that in an individual organism that has been lost to the species over time. Like I had a friend in graduate school who had a vestigial gill on his neck, and it would like weep little bits of water. And so that's what they would call like an atavistic trait, right? That he had that in utero, and but not lost it, sort of, I guess. Or like in um, certain embryos of marine mammals like whales, dolphins, there will be these vestigial kind of legs, and that then disappear as the fetus develops, because of course whales were once land animals in evolutionary time. So that's kind of what I was referring to, but I don't think I can completely sufficiently answer the question because really it was also my substitute title. Like a title that was actually that meant something to me, that was resonant and vexed like the characters, that sort of encapsulated all of them. But I don't know that I've thought generally of how to characterize sort of the role of atavism in contemporary culture as a whole. Is that an okay response? Is my questioner satisfied, or no?
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess I've just been noticing how like a lot of us, myself included, are kind of operating on this weird mix of survival instinct and modern stress.
Mm-hmm.
And like we're trying to be rational or evolve, right? But underneath all that, there's all this old feelings of fear, longing,
Yeah.
shame. So
That's a good
when
answer. Can I use that? That's really good. No, that's exactly right, I think. Yeah.
yeah, so when I read about your book, it made me think like maybe we're not as far from our instincts as we pretend to be.
No, I think
So
that's yeah, that's clearly accurate.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thank
that.
you.
Thanks for that.
Thank you, Lydia and T. The next question's from me. I'm always curious what the authors have next in mind. I'm sure this project took you years to um, complete, and I'm always curious what you have, what you're looking forward to next. And as this is a collection of short stories, are there sort of untied or loose ends that you hope to kind of follow, or anything else that you're really excited for, which could be just rest and doing nothing too.
Well, I have next coming out next year a couple of twin sort of like two novels that go together that probably will be bound together like as a single
Oh,
volume. And so they're also it's also chronologically sort of like it starts in time through one person's perspective, and then that ends, and then it continues um where that ended from another character's perspective. So it's not like a Rashomon thing where it's different perspectives on the same time, really, but it's like two friends sort of back to back. And so that's the next thing I have coming out, but I'm working on a couple of different novels right now. One called Spartacus, and actually a couple more in the background that I sort of put aside after inauguration day because they didn't have the right kind of emotional tone for me. uh, so now I'm working on Spartago, which is sort of a more warlike book. So
I
that's what I'm
just love
doing. How
it.
about you? Mandana, do you want to talk about anything you're writing?
Oh God, no, not when I'm
Okay,
talking
all
to you. I
right,
don't.
all right. I would be interested.
You're very dear to say that, but oh my goodness, no. Um, I have to say Spartacus is very any relation to the I am Spartacus. Again, I'm showing
Yes,
age. I'm
yes,
showing age, but
yes,
I am Spartacus. No, I am Spartacus. That is
yes.
very. Have you ever written? I'm so sorry, man. Will you forgive me? Have you ever written speculative fiction?
Yes, I mean, so one thing I did a YA book that was published called Pills and Starships that is spec clearly like genre fiction. Also trilogy for middle readers that I wrote, which is somewhat spec. It's like set in the real contemporary world, but it is certainly it's more like fantasy, I guess.
Yeah.
And that was published some years ago. Uh, let's see. And then I have a book that I've put aside for now because a dear friend told me it was terrible.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah, yeah. And I believed him. I believed him for now. But that was real, like spec fiction for grown-ups, and it's called The Perversions. And I may like take it out and write it again one day. But yes, I do sometimes write spec fiction.
I demand that you take that out immediately and write
No,
it.
no, it's probably it's I believe him that it's bad.
But I
It's
was going to
it's a tough
say that
thing
is a
with
good.
like
If it's a
well,
if it's a friend who always supports you, but would say that actually, as a writer, I will say that is a good friend for someone.
yeah, I agree. I agree.
That is
Yeah.
a good.
Yeah. In fact, it was my former publisher who told me that. And he's a close friend now. But anyway, I do think that with spec fiction, you have to know like when to stop world building
Mm,
and and the world was just kind of overbuilt.
yeah, I
You know what
hear.
I mean? It was
Yes,
overbuilt, it
I
was
do.
over decorated. Yeah, the characters in it I think couldn't breathe enough. But
Mm.
maybe they can be rescued
Well,
over time.
you make that good point because at the end of the day, the spec fiction it still has to have people in there. You know
Yeah,
what? Even
right. And they
even
have to be
even if they're Cylons, the
right,
Cylons look and sound like people, but there has to
right.
be that something like that in there, not just. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I guess
It's a thing
wasn't
of
it Coco
breath. Like
Chanel
you,
who said,
yeah,
dress up, put on your accessories, and then take two off? So maybe with the world building, you just need to take two off in some little.
maybe. Maybe, yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, man, I totally derailed. Go right ahead.
No, you're all good. So much to look forward to, Lydia. And our last question is going to come from Elizabeth.
Thanks, Min, and thank you so much, Lydia and Mandana, for this great conversation. This is sort of like a nerdy writer question, but I'm a huge fan of short story collections, sort of examining them from like a craft perspective. And I was so struck among the many things in this collection by your pacing, both within each individual story and then how they all came together in the collection. It's like you have these characters that are all so separate in their identities, and their pacing seemed on par with who they were as characters, and then they all woven together as a collection. The pacing was so wonderful, and I'm wondering if you have any advice for other writers in this room right now about how you achieve that in a short story collection.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you. I a couple things just, you know, I'm not really a good advisor, but a couple of things I would say. One is that like I've really grown to love dialogue and I think lean into dialogue because if you end up having too much of it, you can always take some out. And it's such a great shorthand, especially for short stories, right? Like it's such a great shorthand for who people are. So I think lean into dialogue partly. Um, and then the other thing is just always, read excellent short stories, read short stories that are beautifully constructed. Um, and that includes like sort of micro fictions, so-called. I always think that Lydia Davis should be read for that. And I also really loved Joy Williams is also is great with short stories and nonfiction, and she wrote like her essays are excellent too. But she a fairly recent book of hers called 99 Stories of God, I think is really kick-ass because funny and also just sort of perfectly crafted. So I don't know. Those are two people I would read for short story rhythm.
Thank you so much. They're two of my favorites too.
Oh, excellent. Well, everyone here should read them for sure if they haven't already.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lydia and Mandana, for such an inspiring conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with gallerist Joan Washburn and Rail contributor Amanda Millet Sorsa on the over 50-year history of Washburn Gallery. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks all.
Thank
Lydia, thank you
you.
so
Thank you
much.
so
Such a
much.
fantastic
It's a great
conversation.
conversation.
Thank
We
you, Lydia.
appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Mandana.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Lydia.
Madonna.
Say,
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thank
Mandana.
thank you guys so
Bye,
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Mandana.
Bye.
Thank you
Congratulations
so
on the
much.
book.
Yes, congrats.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Lee.